Thank you, Madam Speaker. I really, truly want to start by expressing gratitude to the Minister for bringing water to the legislature floor. It is the most important thing. Water is life, as we all know, and I am truly grateful for the Minister's work to bring this bill to the legislature. It's just nice to talk about water, really. It is a really long time since the Water Act has been updated, and so there's a real opportunity here. Water is a significant issue for all of our communities, and industries care about this. It's the foundation, obviously, of the water that I'm drinking today in the House, but it's also a foundation of economic growth and economic success for many industries across the province. It wasn't a prop, I'm actually thirsty. So water drives industry success. It is an essential part of our economy. It's important for people and communities. It's also needed for wildlife and habitat and a ton of ecological goods and services that come with that. And in engaging in the creation of this bill, I also want to acknowledge and thank the Minister for the truly robust public consultation process that happened here. It was impressive to watch. And there were a lot of Albertans involved who had an opportunity to participate and share their views. And there's two things in particular that I want to acknowledge. And the first one is that the Minister displayed flexibility in addressing people's concerns as they were going through the consultation. Not every minister in this House has done that, Madam Speaker, and that is commendable. So thank you to the Minister for doing that. She adjusted timelines when people asked for more time, and the majority of amendments that were consulted on are reflected in this bill. And so that is also something that's super great. And there's more consultation coming as they develop the regulations. And so, you know, I think one of the things that's hard about water is that there's like the legislation, there's the policy, there's the regulations. And I don't think that people always understand which belongs where, and so I'm excited about the consultation on the regulations also. There are good parts about this bill, Madam Speaker, but of course I have areas of concern. I'm sure that's not going to come as a surprise to anybody. So I want to first start by talking about the merging of the Peace, Slave, and the Athabasca River basins into the Peace, Athabasca, Slave River Basin. This is a significant change to water planning and management in the province. Alberta is a signatory of the Mackenzie River Master Agreement with the Northwest Territories, BC, Saskatchewan, Yukon, and Canada. And in that master agreement, no one jurisdiction can act unilaterally to make significant changes. There are legal obligations to honour its commitments to manage the entire Mackenzie Basin, not just the main stem and the sub-basins that are in Alberta. And that agreement requires that each jurisdiction give prior notice if doing anything that will impact another. Merging these basins has the potential to do that, Madam Speaker. And so we need to make sure that those other jurisdictions have been notified and that they've been given sufficient time to respond to this change. I did talk with some people in the Northwest Territories in government who didn't know if that consultation had happened. And so I guess what I'm asking the Minister for is perhaps in Committee of the Whole, when we get more into the debate, maybe she can share when and where those conversations happened and what the outcome of those conversations were. The original separation of basins is based on broad principles of watershed management, and so I'm also wanting to better understand why this is a clause in this bill and what the justification and the background is for that, particularly since we also have this idea of the low-risk interbasin transfers. If we amalgamate these two basins, then something that would have previously been an interbasin transfer no longer becomes one. And then it's not limited or managed in the same way. And so I think the implications of combining these two basins into one are significant, and I look forward to the Minister explaining why and what is driving that decision and what data supports that amalgamation. Because it's my understanding that data feeds into the definition of how these water basins are mapped. how we draw the lines on the map, and so what data is supporting bringing them together, I guess, is my bigger question there. I do think that this idea of merging these basins together requires a bit more consultation with parties outside and inside of Alberta. Yeah, I think there needs more conversation there. The interbasin transfers, I think, is a big part of this bill, and it's probably the most controversial part. I will say that when you say the words interbasin transfer, there are people who instantly get kind of like anxious, right? Like, those words can mean a lot to a lot of people, and people automatically start thinking about the risks of invasive species and implications for how water is moved around the landscape and shared, and what if there's drought over here and not over here. So I do appreciate the criteria in the bill that defines a low-risk transfer and committing to what is called low-risk transfers. I think that could be strengthened, and I'll get into that in a little bit right here. So currently, interbasin transfers are permitted, as the minister said, through a special act in the legislature, and there have only been 7 approved so far, and that's because it is a little bit harder to do, right? It has to be a special act in the legislature, which means that it has to be debated, and there's a robust public review and opportunity for really anybody to review and share their views through us as elected officials. So I feel like there's got to be some kind of middle ground here, Madam Speaker, right? Like, I agree with the minister in times of drought, later in the summer when things are the driest, that we might not be in the legislature to have this debate about a low-risk interbasin transfer. So I can appreciate that timeline, but also I do want to make sure that we are being very thoughtful and considerate about interbasin transfers and whether or not one is required when it is being asked for. I think we do our due diligence to serve current and future generations when we really take the time to consider the potential implications of interbasin transfers. The criteria in the bill are great, but they're not comprehensive. In particular, Madam Speaker, I'd love to see more conversation around the pre and the post pieces of an interbasin transfer. So, like, what happens before a company or a proponent comes forward with the idea of an interbasin transfer? What work have they done to show that this is the last resort, this is the only option that will actually work for them? Because as one stakeholder told me, if you're talking about an interbasin transfer, you've already screwed up somewhere. You've already used too much water in your basin, and you've already, kind of not thought through the actual realities of how much water is available. So, I mean, that may or may not be true, but I think there's a need to have some justification before to demonstrate that this is required. And then I'd love to see some criteria about the post piece. Once an interbasin transfer is permitted, what is the monitoring requirements? How do we know that it will be okay? Is there regular monitoring? What are the thresholds and criteria? The thresholds and criteria don't have to be defined in the legislation. I guess that could be regulations. But what happens if those thresholds and criteria are violated? Will we be able to withdraw that interbasin transfer in the event that it doesn't work the way that we thought it would in the first place? And so to address these risks, I'm also concerned with a couple clauses in this interbasin transfer section. 47(1)B talks about the opinion of the director in regards to invasive species risk. That shouldn't be the opinion of the director. That should just be based on data. Is there a risk of introducing invasive species? What does the data say? I'm a little concerned about the word opinion there. And then section 47(3) puts a lot of power in the minister's hands that the minister may, by order, authorize the director to issue a license for an interbasin transfer. This is a pattern that we've seen, Madam Speaker, with this current government, is centralizing a lot of power in the minister's office. And this minister knows that I respect her and I respect her work, but eventually one day she won't be the minister sitting in that chair. Maybe she'll be sitting in another chair. I mean, that's not what I wish, but It probably is going to happen. So what happens when a different minister is sitting in that chair, Madam Speaker? Anytime we have legislation that authorizes a minister to make these decisions without public oversight or review, it just raises a flag of concern for me, because we need to make sure that it's not just the minister who is making these decisions, but that those decisions are informed by data or experts or people working in the public service or whatever. So I always get worried when there's too much power in the minister's office, because these decisions should be based on science and evidence. The other challenge with these interbasin transfers, Madam Speaker, is that there's no opportunity for public review or appeal. And I think that that's a really important part of this, because people in the public are so concerned about interbasin transfers. We need to make sure that there's a mechanism to report to the public and ask them if they are okay with it, if the public also perceives this to be a low-risk interbasin transfer. Cumulative thresholds are not set, so maybe that will come out of the regulations, that there's going to be a total amount volume or not distance, but a total amount of volume for interbasin transfers in a particular area. And I really think that particularly, again, applies to the merging of those two basins up north, that there's no maximum then, because they'll just all be one basin. So how are we going to account for that in this bill? There are some good moves forward in this bill, like I said at the beginning, so there are things that I liked. So for example, simplifying water licensing process to consolidate multiple allocations. This does serve an issue that irrigators have brought forward. It decreases administrative delays for them with the timelines, and it reduces red tape in the ag sector. And that is great. Increasing efficiencies in this regard is a positive move forward. Increased reporting and monitoring. Of course, I'm a fan. I ask the minister about increased monitoring and reporting all the time. So yes, I do appreciate that. I do think in the conversation with the regulations, we'll need to be careful to talk about how we're going to support users to meet these requirements with either technology or training. And, Madam Speaker, there needs to be more jobs in the public service to enforce this and to support water license holders to work through these new monitoring requirements. So I also look forward to seeing a whole bunch of jobs posted on the government website in environment and protected areas to help implement this bill. Users also need to know what their monitoring data is going to be used for. That was one of the common themes I heard from users, is if I'm collecting this monitoring data, where is it going? Will it be publicly available? Spoiler alert, the answer to that should be yes, but not with names. Privacy can still be maintained, obviously. And then the other piece I think really came out of the conversations that I had with the WPACs was how will that data feed into the WPACs so that they can write their State of the Basin reports. And these WPACs are really committed groups of people who are understanding their local watershed in a really intimate way, and they rely on the government-created monitoring data or the government-gathered monitoring data to inform their State of the Basin reports. So then the other piece that I wish was reflected in this legislation is something that links those State of the Basin reports to local decision-making. So when we're talking about an interbasin transfer for a municipality, for example, is the State of the Basin report from that local WPAC part of the decision-making, part of recognizing that that interbasin transfer is necessary for that municipality? I wish that was reflected here more. I love the definition of water to include rainwater. Greenhouses obviously love that, and well, maybe not obviously, but they do. And so there's a huge benefit to the ag sector in that way as well. So the redefinition of rainwater is great, and including a more robust definition of good standing and related to compliance with the conditions of the license, I also am a fan of. There are a few things missing from this bill, Madam Speaker, that were part of the public consultations, but aren't necessarily reflected, and so I'm hoping that we can have a conversation around some of that as well. So First of all, the environmental requirements. The minister and the deputy minister have told me that environment is a priority, and I believe that it is, but I think it needs to be reflected in these amendments more. So, for example, in Section 54, a lot of these director-led amendments to licenses should consider in-stream flows and water quality and impact to meeting water conservation objectives directly in the legislation. The State of the Basin reports from the WPACs should be in the decision-making, and I think that those should be listed too as something the director will consider when looking at these amendments to licenses. In the water for reuse clauses, which is also a good part of this bill, is finding ways for us to reuse water, but we need to think about environmental impacts, water conservation objectives, and those should also be directly addressed in this bill. There is requirements for sharing timelines for decisions and meeting timelines for decisions. I wish that there was also going to be timelines for the monitoring data and for the public sharing of that monitoring data. So that's all. I think we just need more jobs in the public service and more government monitoring. I like jobs. And I think there's a lot of really good people out there who are waiting to do this kind of water monitoring work. So I think that that's important. Something that is also not reflected in the Act, Madam Speaker, is any kind of emphasis on nature-based solutions. Wetlands will store water and slowly release it over the summer. They address flood and drought. I wish we had some focus anywhere in this Act, it would be great, around nature-based solutions and how we can get wetlands to work for us, as well as intact forests. And when I was thinking about intact forests, I realized how this Act actually ties to so many other acts, and it relates to the Forestry Act and the Land Use Framework and ALSA and the stewardship and like all of these things. If I start thinking about it, the list of acts is so long, and so that doesn't necessarily have to be in the Act, but I look forward to the minister describing how she sees this Water Amendment Act tying into these other pieces of legislation to make sure that we are considering the broader landscape. In particular, I'm curious about the All-Season Resorts Act. That's a new piece of legislation. I know from going out on the Eastern Slopes this summer, Madam Speaker, there's rumors of all kinds of resorts popping up. And I don't know where these rumors are coming from, but people are like, well, they want to put a lodge up here and this over here. And then the next question that I hear is, where's the water going to come from? So how are we making sure that what we're doing in the Water Act and with these licenses is going to relate to these all-season resorts? The other piece that is not really in here but should be is protecting our headwaters in some way and addressing cumulative effects. Cumulative effects across Alberta, especially on the Eastern Slopes and in our headwaters, is an issue of increasing importance. And this comes down to a whole bunch of things. It comes down to public lands management. And when I talk about protecting our headwaters, Madam Speaker, I'm not necessarily talking about protected areas, like parks per se. I'm more talking about land use planning and how we prioritize and shape land use planning to make sure that our headwaters are protected and that the water continues to flow. If we impede flow and quality, like water quality from our headwaters, it just creates a whole array of issues downstream. And so how is protection of our headwaters reflected in this? And how does this bill help us address cumulative effects? Because I can tell you, Madam Speaker, when I go out on the Eastern Slopes, the thing that I think about the most right now is that we are asking too much of this landscape. We're still asking the landscape to be everything to everybody all the time. And so all of our pieces of legislation that are land-based or water-based should be considering these cumulative effects. First Nations are calling for clear, enforceable definitions of cumulative effects in law. I'm sure some of my colleagues, you can probably guess who they are going to be speaking to some of the First Nations issues and concerns with this bill. And also, we need to consider the enforcement, Madam Speaker. Enforcement takes capacity. And I think that there's a double edge of carrot and stick here, right? It's like working with people to help them with this. At the end of the day, I look forward to debating this bill. It's a great step forward, and I think we'll have some great discussion. Thank you.